There comes a moment in your life when you realize that not every accusation deserves an answer, not every provocation deserves a reaction, and not every person deserves access to your emotional energy. That moment is powerful because it marks a shift from emotional dependence to emotional authority. You stop asking, "What should I say so they understand me?" And you begin asking a much more important question: why am I allowing their behavior to determine my emotional state? Think about how much power we give away through reaction. Someone says something disrespectful, and suddenly your entire day changes. Someone ignores you, and you spend hours wondering why someone criticizes you, and you feel compelled to explain yourself. Someone tries to provoke you, and before you even realize what has happened, you are defending, arguing, proving, or reacting. But what if you stopped? Not because you are afraid, not because you have nothing to say, but because you have finally recognized that your reaction is valuable. This is where silence becomes psychologically powerful. Silence creates a space between what happens to you and what you choose to do about it. And inside that space is your freedom. The person who once knew exactly what to say to make you angry suddenly discovers that the old buttons no longer work. They may repeat the same behavior. They may become louder. They may push harder. They may even question why you are suddenly so quiet. But something has changed. You have changed, and that change can be uncomfortable for people who benefited from the old version of you. Understand this: people don't always miss you when you become silent. Sometimes they miss the access they had to you. They miss your explanations. They miss your emotional reactions. They miss knowing that one sentence could pull you into an argument for the next 3 hours. When you stop giving them that access, they are forced to confront a new reality. They cannot control your emotional state anymore. And that is not arrogance. That is maturity. There is a profound difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from strength. Fearful silence says, "I'm afraid to speak because I don't know what will happen." Mature silence says, "I know exactly what I could say, but I have decided that saying it will not improve the situation." That distinction matters, because sometimes we think strength means having the final word. We imagine victory as winning the argument, exposing the other person, proving that we were right, or making them regret what they did. But emotional strength operates according to a different philosophy. It asks, what outcome do I actually want? If the answer is peace, then why participate in chaos? If the answer is growth, then why keep rehearsing the same argument? If the answer is freedom, then why keep giving another person the authority to determine how you feel? You don't have to attend every argument you are invited to. You don't have to respond to every accusation. You don't have to correct every misunderstanding. And you certainly don't have to prove your worth to someone who has already decided not to recognize it. There will be people who interpret your silence as weakness because they only understood your strength when it was loud. Let them misunderstand you. Your responsibility is not to manage everyone's perception of you. Your responsibility is to manage yourself. That is where real transformation begins. When you master your reaction, you reclaim your attention. When you reclaim your attention, you reclaim your energy. And when you reclaim your energy, you can finally invest it into the life you are trying to build. So the next time someone tries to provoke you, pause, take a breath, ask yourself, is this worth my peace? And if the answer is no, let your silence say what your anger never could. Your greatest power is not making them react. It is becoming someone they can no longer control. They expected a reaction. That is the part you need to understand. When someone has become accustomed to getting an emotional response from you, your reaction becomes predictable. They say something cruel, you defend yourself. They withdraw, you chase them. They accuse you, you explain. They provoke you, you become angry. And because the pattern repeats, they begin to believe they understand you. They know which words will make you uncomfortable. They know which subjects will make you defensive. They know how to create confusion and then watch you desperately try to restore clarity. But what happens when you stop? What happens when the person who once controlled the conversation suddenly discovers that you are no longer participating in the same emotional game? That is where your power begins to return. Human beings are creatures of patterns. We learn what actions produce what responses. If someone repeatedly provokes you and you repeatedly react, their behavior becomes reinforced. They learn, consciously or unconsciously, that pressing a certain button produces a predictable result. But when you change the response, you change the entire system. This is why your silence can be so powerful. Not because silence magically controls another person, but because it breaks the expectation they built around you. They expected you to defend yourself, you didn't. They expected you to become angry, you remained calm. They expected you to chase after an explanation. You continued with your life. They expected the old version of you, but the old version of you is no longer available, and that can be deeply unsettling to someone who benefited from your emotional reactions. Now, be careful here. Silence is not about playing psychological games. It is not about ignoring someone simply to make them suffer. That is still emotional dependence because you are secretly waiting for their reaction. Real emotional freedom is different. You become silent because you no longer need to prove anything. You stop responding because you recognize that some conversations are designed to drain you rather than resolve anything. You stop explaining yourself because you understand that someone committed to misunderstanding. You will simply use your explanation as another opportunity to argue. Think about how much energy you have wasted trying to convince people of your intentions. How many times have you explained yourself to someone who had already made up their mind? How many times have you written long messages because you desperately wanted someone to understand your heart? How many times did you think, if I can just explain this one more time, they'll finally see the truth? But sometimes they don't want clarity. Sometimes they want access. Access to your attention, access to your emotions, access to your time. And once you recognize that distinction, everything changes. You stop asking, how can I make them understand me? You start asking, why am I still trying to be understood by someone who has no intention of understanding me? That question can change your life, because peace begins where the need for constant validation ends. You don't need to respond to every accusation. You don't need to correct every rumor. You don't need to defend yourself against every opinion. And you don't need to prove that you are a good person to someone determined to see you negatively. The most powerful response to someone who expects you to remain emotionally reactive is not a dramatic confrontation. It is transformation. Become calmer, become wiser, become disciplined, become so focused on building your future that you no longer have the time or desire to keep revisiting the past. And eventually they may realize something uncomfortable. They can still speak, but they can no longer control what happens inside you. That is the victory. Not that they become frustrated, not that they regret losing access to you, not even that they finally recognize your value. The victory is that their behavior no longer determines your behavior. You have broken the pattern, and once you break the pattern, you don't have to announce it. Let them expect the old you. Then let your peace prove that you have become someone new. There is something powerful that happens when you stop reacting to someone and start observing them. When you are constantly defending yourself, you are inside the conflict. You are emotionally involved in every accusation, every criticism, every subtle insult. You are trying to correct the story while the other person is creating more chapters. And because you are constantly responding, you never get enough distance to see what is actually happening. But silence creates distance, and distance creates perspective. Sometimes the reason people become uncomfortable with your silence is because your silence removes the distraction. When you were arguing, they could focus on your anger. When you were defending yourself, they could focus on your explanations. When you were emotional, they could point to your emotions and make them the subject of the conversation. But when you become calm, there is nowhere for the conversation to hide. Suddenly, their behavior is visible. Their words are visible. Their intentions become easier to recognize. And perhaps most importantly, you become capable of seeing the situation without the emotional fog that once surrounded it. This is one of the great psychological shifts of maturity. You stop asking only, how do I feel about what happened? And begin asking, what does this behavior reveal? That is a completely different question. If someone repeatedly disrespects you, don't just examine your anger, examine the pattern. If someone repeatedly creates confusion, don't just spend hours trying to understand their latest explanation. Examine the pattern. If someone repeatedly hurts you and then expects you to forget it, don't only listen to their apology. Examine whether their behavior has changed. Patterns often tell the truth that individual moments try to hide, and your silence gives you enough emotional space to see those patterns. This is why silence can become a mirror, not a weapon. A mirror. You stop giving the other person another argument to fight, another accusation to respond to, another emotional reaction to analyze. Instead, they are left with their own behavior, and sometimes that is uncomfortable. Because when you stop participating in the cycle, the other person may finally have to confront the part they played in creating it. But here's something even more important. You are also confronted with your own behavior. You may discover that you stayed too long. You may realize that you explained yourself too many times. You may recognize that you accepted treatment you should have challenged. You may even realize that your desire to be understood kept you connected to people who were never interested in understanding you. That realization can hurt, but it can also liberate you, because awareness gives you choices. Once you see the pattern, you can stop repeating it. And this is where silence becomes more than simply not speaking. It becomes an act of conscious self-control. You are saying, I see what is happening, and I refuse to become what this situation is trying to turn me into. That is profound, because the easiest thing in the world is to become bitter after being hurt. The easiest thing is to return cruelty with cruelty, manipulation with manipulation, anger with anger. But if someone brings chaos into your life and you become chaotic in response, they have influenced you. If someone brings hatred and you become hateful, they have changed you. If someone tries to destroy your peace and succeeds, then even if you win the argument, you have still paid too high a price. Your goal is not merely to survive difficult people. Your goal is to remain yourself in their presence. That requires discipline. It requires emotional intelligence. It requires the courage to walk away from conversations that offer no resolution and no growth. And eventually something remarkable happens. You stop needing to know whether they understand. You stop needing them to admit what they did. You stop needing an apology before you allow yourself to move forward. You simply know what you experienced, you know what you learned, and you know what you will no longer tolerate. That is when silence stops being empty. It becomes wisdom. Sometimes the most powerful mirror you can give someone is your refusal to reflect their chaos back at them. Real emotional control is not about becoming emotionless. It is not about pretending you don't care, suppressing your feelings, or acting as though nothing hurts you. That is not strength. That is avoidance. Real strength is feeling everything and still deciding what deserves a response. That distinction changes everything, because anyone can react. Reaction is automatic. Someone insults you and anger rises. Someone disrespects you and your ego demands an answer. Someone rejects you and your mind starts searching for explanations. Someone tries to make you jealous and suddenly you are comparing yourself to another person. The trigger happens and the reaction follows. But emotional control creates a space between those two things. Something happens. You feel it, and then you choose. That small space is where your power lives. Think about how many decisions people make while emotionally overwhelmed. They send messages they later regret. They say things they cannot take back. They destroy relationships because they wanted to win a momentary argument. They make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. Why? Because they confuse intensity with truth. Just because you feel something strongly does not mean you have to act on it immediately. Anger is real, but anger does not always tell you what to do. Fear is real, but fear does not always tell you where to go. Pain is real, but pain does not have to become your personality. You can acknowledge an emotion without allowing it to become your master. That is emotional freedom. And this is why someone who used to trigger you may become confused when you stop reacting. They may think, why isn't this working anymore? Because you have learned to separate their behavior from your identity. Their opinion does not define you. Their rejection does not define you. Their criticism does not define you. Their attempt to provoke you does not require you to participate. You have finally realized that your nervous system does not have to become a battlefield simply because someone else is carrying conflict. And that is an extraordinary level of personal responsibility, because you cannot control what another person says. You cannot control how they behave. You cannot control whether they respect you. You cannot control whether they misunderstand you. But you can control what you do next. That is where your attention belongs. Too many people spend their lives trying to control the uncontrollable while neglecting the one thing they actually possess, their own response. They spend hours thinking, how do I make this person change? A better question is, how do I change the way I participate in this? That question returns power to you, and once you understand this, silence becomes easier. You don't need to answer immediately. You don't need to defend every accusation. You don't need to prove your intentions. You can pause. You can breathe. You can walk away. You can sleep on it. You can decide tomorrow whether the conversation deserves your energy today. That is not weakness. That is discipline. There is a tremendous difference between reacting quickly and responding wisely. Reaction says, "You made me feel this, so I must do something." Response says, "I feel this, but I still decide what happens next." That is maturity, and eventually your emotional control becomes one of the greatest forms of independence you possess. You stop handing people the remote control to your mood. You stop allowing someone's message to determine whether your day is good or bad. You stop allowing someone's silence to determine your worth. You stop allowing someone's rejection to determine your future. You stop allowing someone's anger to become your anger. You become internally anchored. And when you become anchored, people may still try to shake you, but they discover that shaking you is no longer easy. That is the real transformation. Not becoming untouchable, becoming self-directed. You cannot control every trigger, but you can become the person who decides what happens after the trigger.